Your head, your neck, and your groins are considered to be vital spots of the body. You can best protect them by the following illustration. By placing your knees into your gut as tight as possible, by taking your hands and shielding your neck and the back part of your head. Joe, give me an illustration of how to protect yourself. If your partner next to you see that you're being stomped, he comes and falls over you, places his hand in the back of his neck to shield his head and his neck, thus leaving his buttocks and his thighs and his back to take the beating of a nightstick.
I'm Andy Young. For years, I worked alongside Martin Luther King on the dusty roads of the South and in the ghetto streets of the North. In the early 60s, we said no to racism through boycotts, through massive marches, and through the kinds of confrontations you just saw. Now, many of my brothers say no to racism this way.
And before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free.
The marvelous lady you just heard singing is Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer. For 15 years, she served as a timekeeper on one of Mississippi's plantations. Then she decided to register and vote. And for that, she was evicted from her home and all her belongings placed on a highway. But that was the beginning of a marvelous career, fighting injustice from one end of this country to the other. Mrs. Hamer continues to be a powerful and soulful inspiration to us all.
I think that we have always been taught that we had to suffer as Christ suffered. He was killed and all of the followers was persecuted. But I think in terms of what David had to do. David was a shepherd boy, but he was giving service to his people. But it did come in a time in his life he had to slay Goliath.
Black men and women have said no since they were torn from their homes and sent in chains to an American captivity. With Harriet Tubman, it was shouted with defiance. And with Frederick Douglass, it was thrown like a challenge to white America. W.E.B. Du Bois pounded at the hypocrisy of separate but equal as the NAACP argued no to Jim Crow schools, no to Jim Crow trains, no to Jim Crow justice. Only a threatened march on Washington in 1941 by 100,000 blacks led by A. Philip Randolph forced presidential action that said no to Jim Crow hiring. When Negroes launched a Double V for Victory campaign during World War II, it was their way of saying no to fascism abroad and no to racism at home. A century after the Civil War, the lonely voices had grown to an insistent roar. No more, no more. Some said it was the no of the Supreme Court in Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954 that triggered the explosion. In the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Some say it was the black kids of Clay, Kentucky, New Orleans, Louisiana, Clinton, Tennessee, and Little Rock, Arkansas. They braved dynamite, lynching, and bayonets to say no to segregated schools. But for many, it was the simple no of a little lady in Alabama. Rosa Parks refused to give up her bus seat to a young white man in Montgomery in December 1955. She was arrested. A flood of anger was channeled by a new young preacher in town, Martin Luther King, into a militant, nonviolent battering ram. King's Montgomery Improvement Association trudged the streets and kept the buses empty. Finally, on December 21st, 1956, the United States Supreme Court supported the principles of the boycott and outlawed all segregation on buses. Within weeks of the victory, a group of black ministers headed by Martin Luther King, Ralph Abernathy, and Fred Shuttlesworth had formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. They vowed to further the fight against white racism. The philosophies of three great, gentle but powerful men made the civil rights movement possible. 20 centuries ago, a man named Jesus said to his followers, "Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, and pray for them that despitefully use you." 100 years ago, a philosopher named Henry David Thoreau said, "Unjust laws exist. If the law requires you to be the agent of injustice to another, then I say, break the law." 25 years ago, Mahatma Gandhi used love and nonviolence to free India from the rule of the British Empire. Rivers of blood may have to flow before we gain our freedom, but it must be our blood. By breaking unjust laws and suffering the consequences of his actions, Gandhi believed he could appeal to the consciences of the lawmakers. This power to accept brutality without returning it he termed soul power. With soul power, he won freedom for India. King, a minister of Christ and a student of Gandhi and Thoreau, sent out a ringing challenge to Negroes to understand that nonviolence is not a symbol of weakness and cowardice. Southern political leaders responded with threats of massive resistance. Only when it appeared that public education in the South would be closed down rather than integrate did white moderates begin to speak out. Token integration of a few black students in previously all-white schools was their solution. But from February 1960, when 4 silent, neatly dressed black freshmen from North Carolina A&T College took seats in Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro, it became clear that tokenism would not be enough. Greensboro was the fuse for a fire that raced from black campus to black campus across the South. Now the silence was over. The naked assault of soul power against terror exploded in song.
That's why I'm fighting for my rights. Oh, I'm fighting for my rights. Yes, I'm fighting for my rights. Yes, I'm fighting for my rights. Now myself, it had no windows, so the air, it couldn't come through. And I felt so hot and stuffy that I didn't know what.
NAACP lawyer Thurgood Marshall vowed to appeal every fine and fight for protection guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. But the essential battle had now moved from the courts to the streets. On Easter weekend 1960, students from 59 schools met with Martin Luther King and Ella Baker of Southern Christian Leadership Conference at Raleigh, North Carolina. Though they decided to form their own organization, they affirmed the ideal preached by King of nonviolence and love. They called themselves the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
I think that the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee has been more, to me, closer to Christianity than any church I ever walked in. Because here was educated men, young men, that came to Mississippi that never looked down at a person, especially in the rural communities of Mississippi, but really got out there to say, you know what's happening, get up and say it yourself. It was people like that that made me be what I am today. It was things I've always wanted to say, but they gave me confidence. This hadn't happened in this country before. And I think the country had its best at that point.
In 1961, the law of the land was that all interstate travel facilities must be integrated. On May 4th, 7 black and 6 white members of CORE boarded 2 buses in Washington and headed for New Orleans. They were determined to see if the law was being enforced.
Anniston, Alabama, freedom bus ambushed by white mob, riders beaten. Birmingham, Alabama, freedom riders attacked with iron bars by white gang in bus terminal. Police Chief Bull Connor said today Birmingham police were not able to protect the riders because so many of the police were off for Mother's Day. President Kennedy insists Alabama protect freedom riders. No police visible as mob attacks riders in Alabama Capitol. President orders intervention of federal marshals. Troops protect buses en route to Mississippi.
Now a wave of freedom rides surged through the South, testing the laws and filling the jail. By fall, the Interstate Commerce Commission forbade discrimination on interstate trains, buses, and terminals. The offending signs, white and colored, came down. In 1962, James Meredith broke the color line at the University of Mississippi. His enrollment triggered a riot by whites. During the violence, 2 were killed, and 15,000 soldiers encamped on the campus to keep the peace. Total segregation in Mississippi had been cracked, but not in Birmingham, Alabama. For another year, Birmingham continued to flout Supreme Court orders to desegregate public facilities.
I'm talking about a black dog. I'm talking about a white dog.
On April 3rd, 1963, a sustained assault of marches and demonstrations against segregation was launched by the long-suffering blacks of Birmingham and Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Birmingham, which had tolerated the bombing by the Klan of 50 Negro homes, responded with fury. Public indignation at the police violence forced Washington to intervene. The Klan responded by burning a cross and dynamiting the home of Dr. King's brother. Only then did the nonviolent demonstrations become a riot. America sensed that a great moment of conscience was at hand. Summoned by the great black labor leader A. Philip Randolph, 250,000 men and women marched on Washington in August 1963, the greatest demonstration in the nation's history. Two voices, one angry and one prophetic, are best remembered. John Lewis of SNCC said, "We're tired of being beaten up by policemen. We're tired of having our people locked up in jails. You holla, be patient. We want our freedom and we want it now." Martin Luther King said,
"I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood."
President Kennedy proposed to a still reluctant Congress a strong civil rights bill.
Those who do nothing are inviting shame as well as violence. Those who act boldly are recognizing right as well as reality.
The measure calling for an end to discrimination in jobs, schools, and public accommodations bogged down in a Southern-dominated committee. but the killing continued. Medgar Evers, NAACP Field Secretary, killed by a sniper in Mississippi. William Moore, Freedom Walker, killed by sniper in Alabama. Carol McNair, Addie Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robinson, killed while at prayer in Birmingham Church by bomb. The ruthless killing of the Birmingham children brought the tactic of nonviolence under strong attack in the black community. Robert Williams, a North Carolina leader of the NAACP, said, "As a tactic, we use and approve nonviolent resistance, but we also believe that a man cannot have dignity if he refuses to defend his family and himself." Though a few sought guns for self-defense, the movement continued to insist on nonviolence. In 1963, a young, gentle ex-school teacher named Bob Moses moved from campus to campus across the country. A freedom rider from New York City, he had gone to Mississippi in 1961 and remained. Now he was mobilizing a nonviolent army to break open the closed society. 1,000 strong, their mission would be to establish black community centers, teach black children in freedom schools, and register black voters in Mississippi. Against them was arrayed the power of an armed state. In June 1964, the volunteers met in Ohio with the black and white veterans of the struggle in Mississippi, learning what they might expect.
We've got to fight, although we have to cry. We've got to hold on.
You've got to expect to be afraid.
Don't come to Mississippi to save the Mississippi Negro. Only come if you really understand that his freedom and yours are one.
At week's end, they entered Mississippi.
What we got, we wants to share with you. You're all so welcome.
Andy Goodman is missing in Philadelphia.
And Cheney and Schwerner, too. Where in Mississippi is Philadelphia?
When it's dark, you should be in your houses. When you're not working, stay out of sight.
The boys are still missing. Have your local families call us immediately if you're not home at the expected time.
They found a burned-out station wagon. No trace of the boys.
We're going to light a lamp here in Mississippi, and it's going to shine its light all over the devil.
I'm gonna let it shine. Oh, this little light of mine. I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine. I'm gonna let it shine. Oh, let the light of freedom.
We're here to get folks registered, and we start tomorrow.
You want your kids chopping cotton for $3 a day? Then register.
The folks are scared, but we've got to get them to try to register at the courthouse.
We'll be right with you when you go up the steps to register. Mr. Charlie says run. We ain't running.
Washington. The FBI announced today the arrest of members of a mob led by Deputy Sheriff Cecil Price in connection with the murder of civil rights workers Andy Goodman, James Cheney, and Michael Schwerner.
By the end of the summer 1964, hundreds had been beaten and arrested. 66 homes and churches had been set afire. But 55,000 Negroes had been registered in a black Freedom Democratic Party. 30,000 had been enrolled in freedom schools. 40 community center programs had been begun, and a reluctant Congress had been moved to pass the Civil Rights Bill of 1964. Early in 1965, Nobel Peace Prize winner Martin Luther King was thrown into a Selma, Alabama jail. His drive to register Alabama Negroes was under attack by Sheriff Jim Clark. Using electric cattle prods on people, Clark's police had attacked the crowds of potential registrants. Many, including King, had been arrested. An attempt to lead a march from Selma to the state capitol in Montgomery was savagely attacked. 25,000 indignant Americans poured into Selma to resume the interrupted march to Montgomery. It was the last great affirmation of black and white together of the civil rights movement in the South. President Johnson called a joint session of Congress. His plea for voting rights legislation resulted in the passage of the Voting Rights Bill of 1965. In 1966, more than 10,000 Negroes registered to vote in Selma, where a year before there were only 355 black voters. Sheriff Jim Clark was defeated at the polls. James Meredith, now a graduate from Ole Miss, began a lonely march against fear through the Mississippi Delta. He sought to inspire blacks to stand up and demand their political rights. On the second day, a white man carrying a shotgun fired point blank at the unarmed Meredith and gunned him down. The 3 shots failed to kill James Meredith, but they may well have signaled the end of the integrated nonviolent civil rights movement. Though Martin Luther King would continue his mission of reconciliation for another 3 years, a new black militancy was sounded. It was born of bitterness and frustration. For 5 years, Stokely Carmichael had been hounded by vigilantes and beaten by Southern police. Like so many in the movement, he had seen his friends shot and their churches bombed. He had seen law made a mockery by racist judges and all-white juries. When he resumed Meredith's unfinished march against fear, he raised a defiant fist and shouted, "Black power."
You know, a few years ago, everybody, the country went raving mad when Stokely Carmichael just said the word black power. We have been black powerless people for 400 years. I've seen people boxed in, black children, in Harlem of New York. I've seen people boxed in, black people, in Chicago, Illinois, in the slums, with the babies sick, rats eating on the babies. In the state of Mississippi, I've seen black powerless people raped, hung, murdered. And we know that this country was built on the sweats and blood of black people.
People don't use the word, don't use the word black power, you scare white folk. How many times they call you nigger? You tell them not to use the word?
Yeah,
do you ever hear them get up and tell another white man, don't use the word nigger, because you will alienate some black people?
No.
But you use the word black power, and they're going to jump up there and tell you, don't use it because you're going to alienate some of our good white friends. It's about time we talk to black people later for white folks.
So what we mean by black power is we mean to have not only black political power, but black economic power, to have a voice in the educational system, that our kids will know, not only the black kids, but the white kids should know the kind of contributions that have been made by black people throughout this country. We want to determine some of our destiny. And this is what black power means. We want to have something to say about our destiny.
Now the struggle is being waged not only in the ghettos of the North and in the Jim Crow South, but in the farmlands of California, the mountains of Appalachia, and the Indian reservations across the West. Everywhere, a new generation of men is seeking to build political and economic power for a new assault on injustice. But this is not just their struggle. It's the struggle of all of us. It's the struggle to redeem the soul of America.
This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Oh, I've got the light of freedom, I'm gonna let it shine. I've got the light of freedom, I'm gonna let it shine. I've got the light of freedom, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine.